Good morning, Dr. Emma. Thank you very much
Good
for
morning.
joining us today. Good morning. The recent discovery of Shanidar Z at Shanidar in Kurdistan has been a breakthrough for the scientific community and also for Kurdistan. We are very excited to talk about this today. First, I would like to start with a question what makes Shanidar Z so unique compared to others that have been found there?
So there are various things. One is that we know that she's female, and many of the others that have been discovered at Shannon are male. And we've got independent confirmation of this from various lines of evidence. She's also quite an old individual, which is also quite interesting. And finally, she's also part of a tight cluster of individuals that seem to have been buried in exactly the same place in the middle of the cave behind a huge stone. And although some of those same individuals from that cluster were found in 1960, this is the first individual where we can really apply all of the techniques of modern archaeological science to really understand how she got to be there, the sequence in which the different individuals were placed in that particular place, and other features. So people might have heard of the famous flower burial. We think that probably the flowers came from bees, or the pollen came from bees rather than flowers placed there. But here we have a new opportunity to investigate, for example, whether plants were used in the positioning of this individual. So a really exciting discovery.
Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Emma, a few years ago, at a lecture you gave at the University of Cambridge, you were kind of skeptical about the funerary practices of Neanderthals in Canada. Has the discovery of Shanidar Z provided any new evidences that might change your view on the possibility of Neanderthal flower burial? Or more specifically, has any new evidence emerged or have you reached any new conclusions regarding Neanderthal beliefs or their culture?
Yeah, so with regard to the flower burial, the evidence that we're finding suggests that actually maybe the pollen was brought to that particular spot by bees who were burrowing into the ground rather than necessarily flowers being placed there intentionally. However, we've got some new evidence for the fact that Shandar Zeb was intentionally buried. So we can see that the place where she was placed, it was a natural gully where water had flowed once, but it had been dug intentionally to make the space a bit bigger for her body, and then she'd been covered over. One of the things that we're continuing to investigate, so we do find small pieces of wood, some pollen as well around her body. And what we're trying to do at the moment is understand, is that unique to where her body is, which might suggest that perhaps plants were used, in fact, in some way, not necessarily as flowers, but used perhaps to protect the body when it was deposited. Um, and of course, to do that, we have to be really meticulous. So we have to look at the pollen and the pieces of wood that are around her body, but also compare that to other parts of the cave to see whether it's something that's unique or whether it's actually something that's quite common in the cave. And so perhaps results from natural processes. So that's something we're still working on at the moment.
Yeah, right. Do you believe that ethics and caring for each other preceded religion or they were intertwined? Yeah.
It's quite hard to say. I mean, we do have some quite good evidence from Shanidar Cave that individuals were caring for each other. And that comes from the original excavations as well by Ralph Selecki in the 1950s and up to 1960. And that really questioned prevailing beliefs about Neanderthals at the time. So, for example, Shanidar One did have some really severe injuries, and yet he survived to quite an old age, which suggests he was cared for. And we can also think of burial as being, in some ways, caring for the dead body. So people didn't just abandon someone who died; they actually took effort to place that person in the ground and cover them over. So that suggests care as well. The fact that we have multiple individuals placed in this very same spot in the cave also suggests that there's some developing traditions about how to treat the dead body. And that's in common with today's societies. You know, each society today has a particular way that we treat the dead. Now, whether we can link that actually to early religion is really hard to say. We can see evidence that they are doing something with these bodies and that there's a pattern in the behavior. So maybe there's, a cultural tradition of what you do and where you put the bodies. So this particular space in Shanidar Cave. But what that actually means to the people who did that is very hard to know. So, yeah, whether this is the beginnings of religion at all is a really, really difficult question.
Sure. In terms of collecting genetical material from Shanida, I believe there were attempts to extract DNA from the tibia of one of the Shanidas. Have there been any advancements or progress in this field of study?
So, unfortunately, in terms of DNA from the Shandar Neanderthals, we haven't managed to extract any. So, you're right. We tried to extract some DNA from the Shandar 5 tibia. We've also tried to extract DNA from Shandar Z. So, we tried a tooth, which often preserves DNA really well. We tried a bit of the skull called the petrous portion, which is just behind the ear here, and it's really dense. So, that tends to preserve DNA well. And we also tried one of the bones from the limbs, but unfortunately we didn't have any success, even with the more advanced techniques that we have available to us today. And I think that's just because in more southern parts of the Neanderthal range, the environmental conditions are just not as good for preserving DNA. So where we get Neanderthal DNA, in general, it tends to be in places with colder climates that helps to preserve the DNA better. So yeah, sadly, we haven't had any success. But maybe we can try again in the
That's
future as methods improve.
I believe that the remains of Shanida 4 and 5 are currently in Baghdad. Have you had any opportunity to collaborate with the Iraqi government to study these remains?
So yes, we've been in touch with them and with the museum in particular, and we've got permission to go and study them. We've not had the opportunity to actually go to Baghdad yet, but that's definitely something we're very keen to do and plan to do in the future.
Very good. In the future, as you talked about, what unanswered questions about Shanida Z will researchers, especially you and your colleagues, will focus on?
So some of the big questions that we have about Shandar Z are about her lifestyle. So things like what was her diet like? And we can study that through examining the isotopes, so the different forms of particular chemicals like carbon and nitrogen that are in her teeth. We can also do that through studying the plaque. So that's the stuff that builds up on your teeth, and usually the dentist will remove. But that traps little bits of food, DNA from the things that you're eating, things like that. And so that can give us an extra insight into the kind of things she'd been eating. We're also going to look at her behavior, so the kind of things she was doing on a regular basis. And we can do that through her bones, but also through, again, studying her teeth and how they've worn down, because you can see kind of tiny scratches on the teeth and things like that that give us a nice indication of actually what she was doing. We're hoping to get some indications of where she came from as well. So was she born locally to Shanidar Cave, or perhaps has she come from somewhere else? And again, we can do that through looking at the particular chemical composition of her teeth. So lots of questions. Another one that's really important is actually trying to understand more about the conditions in which she was buried. So, how does she relate and how do her remains relate to some of the remains that were found from that same small cluster in 1960? Can we say that she's part of one of the individuals that was discovered then? And what was the sequence in which they were buried? So, who was buried first? Who was buried later? And what does that tell us about how Neanderthals were using this one spot to deposit their dead?
Too many questions, and they are all interesting to do research
We've got a
about.
lot of work to do
Uh,
still.
yeah, too much work to do. We believe the Kurdish audience is eager to know about your plans for the return of Shanidar Z to Kurdistan. I don't know if there is any plans for that. Could you please update or provide any update on this?
Yeah, so ultimately the remains will be returned to Kurdistan. At the moment, they're on loan very generously from the General Director of Antiquities and also the local directorate in Saran province. And we're very, very grateful for that, to have this opportunity to study them further, but also to help preserve them for the future so that they will survive a long time for other people to study many years away. We're not sure exactly when we'll be able to return them or when we plan to return them. Um, but that's absolutely what will ultimately happen. You know, they will go back to Kurdistan because they're very definitely on loan.
Can you explain the significance of the infant burial discovered at the Shanida? What's the cause of this? Like, what was the cause of death in your belief? Yeah.
Yes, so we have at least two and probably three infants that come from Shanidar. There's one that's part of that same cluster where Shanidar Z and Shanidar 4 come from. Another one that dates to about the same period that was a little more of a distance away. And then a small fragment of another individual. And they were all quite young. It's very difficult from the skeleton to say exactly why they died. But they were all sort of in the range of less than 2 years old. And that is a period we know when children are really particularly vulnerable. I mean, luckily today, we don't experience the same kind of child mortality and infant mortality in sort of much of the West that they would then. I know that's true of the parts of the world, but we're very lucky in the West that's not true today. It is a time when infants are very vulnerable. They're vulnerable to infections, to getting unwell, things like stomach problems and digestive problems, which can actually be really fatal. So we don't know exactly why, but if we look at similar populations who live similar kind of lifestyles in recent history, we know that that's a time when children are particularly vulnerable to die, sadly, from disease in particular.
Yeah, that's very sad. There have been some theories about Baradostian archaeological findings near Shanida number 5, I believe. Uh, have there been any recent updates on this?
Not yet, although it's actually something that we're investigating right now. So some of the team are at Shanidar Cave at the moment, conducting some new excavations to try and understand what that transition is like. So from the last kind of middle Paleolithic, which is a technology that we often associate with Neanderthals and with earlier modern humans, and then how that transition to the Baradostian happens. Is there perhaps times when Neanderthals are using the cave and overlapping a bit with modern humans who are, we think, probably created the Baradostian? Or actually, is there quite a clear transition? So Neanderthals are there first and then they disappear, and then the modern humans producing the Baradostian turn up. Yeah, it's something that we're actually working on at the moment because we need to understand more about how that happened.
So there is still like you have question or research about the connection of the modern humans, and also Neanderthals that were living in Canada, right?
Yes, absolutely. And really interesting questions. We know in other parts of the world, so for example in France, that we have these really interesting patterns of Neanderthals and modern humans overlapping. But in many other parts of the Neanderthal range, we really don't understand that transition very well. So that's hopefully in the future something we'll be able to update everyone about for Shandar Cave in particular. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, talking about the theory of evolution, if the Neanderthals were able to survive in the like difficult conditions they went through, what's your expectation? What would happen to them? Like how they would change or evolve?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question, and it's one that's quite hard to answer. In fact, it's something we're debating in the scientific community right now. So we know that they went extinct about 40,000 years ago, but we really don't understand why that was the case and what happened to them. Um, some people might say that they survive in a way, in that most people in the world today have a really small proportion of Neanderthal DNA. And yeah, what might have happened to them had they survived, we don't know. We do see some patterns of change during their existence. And one of the things that's quite interesting is the closer we get to when they went extinct, we see changes both in their skeletons but also in their DNA that suggest the population is becoming quite vulnerable. So they're becoming quite small. We see evidence of inbreeding, which means sort of closer relatives having children together, and that can make populations very vulnerable to extinction. So yeah, there's interesting questions there about whether that was one factor that contributed to them going extinct, and then whether other changes like the arrival of modern humans or perhaps fluctuations in climate ultimately led to the extinction of this already vulnerable species.
Yeah, finally, Dr. Emma, what other thoughts would you like to share about Kurdistan, about Kurdish people, or what would you like to say to them? And by the way, have you learned Kurdish?
Only a few words of Kurdish, sadly, but it's
Yeah,
something that I'd
like
hope to
Shanibashi,
keep working. Yeah,
like
yeah,
Shanibashi,
yeah. um,
right?
those kind of
Yeah.
things. And but I mean, about Kurdistan itself, it's such a wonderful place. We look forward to going and visiting every year. The people are so kind and so welcoming, and it's something that really we notice so much. We also love the place itself. So the whole team, it's such a beautiful, beautiful part of the world, and it's always a pleasure to be back at Shanidar because it's just stunning. And with the recent Netflix, one of the things for me personally, I hope that people get to see is just how an amazingly beautiful part of the world this is, and how lovely and interesting the people are. As I said, we're so grateful actually for this opportunity to work in Kurdistan. Shandar Cave is such an important archaeological site, and it's a huge, huge privilege for us to be able to work there and to be able to work with the Departments of Antiquities there in Kurdistan. It's really wonderful, and we love every time we're back in the field doing new excavations.
Thank you so much for all your kind words, and I think you have. We also have a privilege that the University of Cambridge and all other universities that collaborating with your team are doing this great and amazing job. I think you are uh, showing a different face of Kurdistan out of war, conflicts, and the crisis that we have. Then you are showing a different story. Thank you very much. It was very fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you for this opportunity. It's always nice to talk about Shandar and about Kurdistan. Like I said, it's a place that we all love. So yeah, great to have this opportunity.